Thank you all for being here today. It's an honor to be here. Third day in a row with nice-ish weather, so we'll take that too. As mentioned previously, I'm Matt Werner. I'm the Coastal Hazard Specialist with the Michigan Coastal Management Program, now out of Eagle. So we've bounced around through the state. The consistent thing is the Coastal Management Program in Michigan has been around for 40 plus years. One of the 34 federally funded and supported coastal management programs in the nation. Our mission here is to protect, preserve, and enhance our more than 3,200 miles of Great Lakes shoreline. So we do that really by providing technical assistance and, as Andrea mentioned, grant funding. Okay, so we want to work with communities, our research partners, our universities, and our citizens to help understand our Great Lakes coastline and to protect and preserve it. One thing about our program that's a little different from some environmental protection programs is the coastal program does look at development as well. We understand that our coasts are developed. It's an important aspect of our coast. And so what we seek to do is foster wise development of our coastline. So our program works through the 5 real focus areas that you see here. And as mentioned, I'm the Coastal Hazard Specialist, so primarily what brings us here today are coastal hazards issues, the erosion and flooding along our Great Lakes coastline. The photo you see there was taken just a few weeks ago up along north central Lake Huron there, so obviously see some of the impacts of water levels on a relatively calm day. In our coastal hazards focus area of our program, what we're primarily looking to do is to minimize community risk, okay, from hazards and flooding. So we want to do that by identifying the hazardous areas, the areas prone to these hazards, so we can avoid development in those areas. And we want to promote wise decision making. So again, why we're here today, to look at how can we infuse coastal hazards information and wise development decisions into our community planning and zoning. It's one of the things we've learned over time too, is that wise development along the coast is a shared management item, okay? We can't do it just at the state level. The feds aren't gonna do it. We all need to work together, so our citizens, our local governments, our state government, our federal government, if we're going to develop resilient coasts. Our strategy, Andrea mentioned and introduced the team. So we've got what I see as a dream team of our researchers. We've got, I think, all aspects hit. We've got the legal piece, the planning and zoning, both research and applied side. And we've got our engineering piece covered. So we've already delved into this strategy. We've been working on a 5-year strategy funded by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So this is a special pot of funding we're using to increase resiliency amongst our coastal communities. We've got another 2.5 years to go. We've already developed some what I think are wonderful products. Hopefully you'll agree. And those are all available. There'll be more discussion about some of the products developed to date and what's coming forth as the day proceeds. But really that's what we're looking to do, is to provide information and knowledge about our Great Lakes coastal processes, opportunities to plan and zone, and we're also working with and through the team to work with communities to really pilot some planning and zoning, some hazards related planning and zoning components. So with that, again, Andrea introduced the team. I won't do that again, but I will pass off to Harry, and thank you again for joining us today.
Nice to be with you. Nice to see so many people who are working in coastal communities, which we've been doing for the last several years. My name is Harry Burkholder. I'm the Executive Director of the Land Information Access Association. We're a nonprofit group out of Traverse City, and as you heard from our previous presenters, we've been working with this team on trying to apply coastal dynamics and coastal processes within master planning efforts at the local level. Part of that is also looking at potential hazards along the Great Lakes, what that means for coastal communities. But we're also doing this type of presentation. So we're doing a lot of public engagement, not only to professional planners, but to local communities, both from a regional perspective, but also at the community level. So We have a small room today of people, so I'd very much like to have this be a conversation. It sounds like you all are working in coastal communities and are all dealing with coastal dynamic hazards, especially now with the high water levels. So what is community resilience? I'm sure you've all heard that term before, and depending on what audience you're speaking to, you're going to have different definitions. Because we're dealing with communities and we're talking about the comprehensive master planning process, the one that we like to use, this is is from the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. And it's the ability of a community to anticipate, accommodate, and positively adapt to or thrive amongst changing climate conditions. So anytime we talk about resilience, we're going to be talking about the world of a changing climate that we're in, or hazard events that enhance quality of life, reliable systems, economic vitality, and conservation of resources for present and future generations. So we're looking at things that we can do better when we respond to essentially shocks to the system. So how quickly can we get back to not just normal after we have a shock to the system, but something better, something more positive for a community. And those shocks are typically, when we talk about, in this context, we're talking about those climate shocks to the system, whether it's a severe storm that's washed out a lot of roads, or a fire, or severe flooding. Those are the shocks to the systems that we're seeing more and more frequently happening in the state of Michigan, especially with our changing climate. And then we also have what we call stresses, those things that are continually happening on a day-to-day basis. We do talk about some of those stresses in a kind of a climatic standpoint, but those are other community development type things, like high unemployment, those stresses that continually impact a community. So when we respond to when we're resilient, we want to respond to those shocks to the systems, but also those stresses to the systems. And we really want to create as a community this adaptive capacity to move beyond that and think and learn about some of those shocks and systems. What does that mean, and how do we respond into something better? Where did the term resilience come from? Well, it has a long history. It's been used in kind of the ecologically and environmental context for the last 200 years. One of the great examples that we talk about when we think about what is resilient from a kind of an ecological standpoint is if we think about the prairie grass that used to make up the middle of the United States and how resilient that was, that those root systems went down 4 feet, so when there was a severe drought, they could still be a livable environment. And what did we do? We destroyed that resilient landscape when we essentially cleared everything for farming, and then we had the massive drought, and that really to severe drought within that area. So think about that in kind of the ecological terms. The idea of being resilient comes from kind of the earth in its most basic tones. As we've kind of moved on to what resilience means now, it's really part of this evolution of things as planners we've been talking about for many years. So sustainable development, resilience really builds on the shoulders of a lot of these movements, which is really looking at how do we do sustainable renewable resources within our community, how do we integrate equity into our community, how do we live in harmony with the nature in our community and the built environment, and then how do we actually do that in a way that exudes public participation throughout the entire community. And then we kind of moved into smart growth, which was really focused on the smart growth principles, which I know you're all familiar with, but really looked at landform and fiscal impacts, how do we respond to sprawl, and then we kind of moved into now what is this kind of resiliency thing. I talked about it a second ago, the measure of the sustainability of a community to utilize available resources to respond to, withstand, and recover from adverse situations is essentially what we're talking about. We're looking at communities that are being able to be responsive to those needs and to those stresses and how to adapt to those, not only at the moment that they're happening, but how do we adapt in terms of how we think about the future of our community and plan for that. So when those things come into the future and we don't know when they will or how severe they will, we're more easily ready to adapt to those pieces. And we're not looking back to get to normal, we're getting back to something that we think is better for a community. I don't know one person who lives in a community that wants to get back to what it was. They always want something back to something that's better. So we're really building on all the things that we've been talking about from sustainability and smart growth into this resilience piece, but we're really trying to pay really specific attention to the science and some of the knowledge and some of the analysis that the rest of the team will be talking about. How do we integrate that into our discussions at the community level? How do we integrate that into our master plans? And if it's in our master plans, hopefully that builds the basis then for kind of the zoning and other programs that you can do in your community. And we're really trying to look at the local level as much as we can. So as much as we can get detailed about your specific community, all the better. That said, when we've talked about resilience at the local level, it's really important to think about how that all fits together, and especially when we're talking about coastal dynamics, when you have several communities sharing that shoreline, that they all play off each other. So thinking about it not only from your individual jurisdiction, but how that impacts your neighbors is part of the idea of being a resilient community. There's lots of different ways that you could go about establishing a framework for resilience, but this is one thing that at least we'd like to do in our plans is kind of set up the idea of what it means and some of the things that we're going to talk about. The American Red Cross, different organizations, this is one from the Rockefeller Foundation, that talks about the different elements of the different parts of a framework that go into a resilient community. And it's all part of a system, which is why we think it's really great to have this discussion baked into a master planning process, because ideally, you're talking about all the different systems in your community. So you're talking about local governance and leadership, you're talking about infrastructure, transportation, local food services, housing and neighborhoods, public resources, energy, jobs. They're all intertwined together, right? They're all part of the larger system that makes your community go. And by the way, for most communities, there's the coastal process that's involved with that. So the more that we can think of this idea as this holistic approach to playing in our community, all the better, because all of these things play off of each other as much as they can. And we're seeing big efforts not only from the federal level, but also at the state level in terms of addressing resilience and climate change, and then some of these coastal processes that we're going to be talking about. So just about every single department in the state of Michigan has a plan that talks about climate adaptation and how to be more resilient, and also at the federal level. So we're seeing a lot of big push from those levels, but we're also seeing a lot of ways that this is being integrated into kind of local planning and zoning. So this is actually an older list, but these are plans that we've seen through part of our research that address climate change or resilience in some way or another, and this list keeps growing, which is great to see. And now we hope to see, now that lake levels are so high, that the attention to the coastal processes will be even greater. So some of the things when we talk about climate change, so the next part of this presentation, I just want to provide a little bit of a framework and context about climate, and then I'm going to turn it over to Guy Meadows, who's going to talk about the lake levels and what that means, especially now. But essentially, the biggest concerns for climate change in the state of Michigan are extreme heat, and the further south you go in the state, the more extreme that is. Heavy rain and flooding, which you've all experienced, especially this spring. Severe winter storms, which we're seeing now can come in late March and sometimes in April. Coastal dynamics, which we'll talk about, how that impacts natural ecosystems, and then what are the impacts to agriculture and our food systems based on this changing climate. So those are the big kind of concerns when we talk about at the community level, what else can we think about in terms of resilience when we're talking about our master planning process. These are larger frameworks, but you can do a lot of other subtopics within these categories, community health, infrastructure, that all speak to these biggest things, to these concerns, but these are kind of the 6 biggest ones. When we think about that coastal piece, those shocks to the systems, we're talking about flooding. Most of you probably remember August of 2014, how painful that was to get around Metro Detroit. But we're seeing more and more examples of like this happening all over the state of Michigan, and really the Great Lakes Basin. Houghton in 2018, I think it was 6 inches in a couple of hours, completely washed away the downtown streets there. Massive amounts of infrastructure damage that had to be fixed. So we're seeing, again, a lot more of these types of storms and a lot more of these severe impacts happening in communities all over the state of Michigan. And then these stresses, I think, are those things that continually happen. And right now we happen to be in this period of stresses with our high lake levels. If we were having this conversation 10 years ago, there might be one person in the room because we didn't have the lake levels that they are right now. So the fact that we're talking about this is really a perfect timing given our lake levels, but that's one of the stresses that we have. And then we have all the dynamic features, environmental features that are in any community, but are especially important on coastal areas like dunes or wetlands that are dynamic and shift over time and have their own kind of environmental focus that add to the things that we can talk about as a community, that's how dynamic they are and how we respond to that. So I'm guessing in this room there's probably not much room for debate on what is weather versus climate change. I'm assuming that sometimes we do this presentation and we see a lot of heads saying no. So I always like to show this animation, if we can get it to go. It takes a little time to queue up and scope out. So obviously weather refers to the atmospheric conditions on a particular place in a particular time. You open your front door, that's your weather. Climate refers to the atmospheric conditions that exist over a region over a long period of time. So over decades, over centuries. And the climate change is really just the difference in that pattern over several months, years, and decades. And so we might have fluctuations. So we might have years where it's cold. We might have years where it's warm, and back and forth and back and forth. But the long trend is showing essentially, like when you walk your dog, the direction that we're going, which is essentially in Michigan and the Great Lakes Basin, wetter and hotter. So just looking at kind of climate change on a couple of perspectives, when we do these talks with communities, people like to know what's happening kind of globally, what's happening in the United States, and maybe what's happening in the Great Lakes Basin. So typically, we actually have Jeff Andreessen, who is the state climatologist, give this presentation. I'm going to attempt to fill in for him on this presentation, but just to provide a kind of an overview of the climate trends that we're seeing. Essentially, this is a chart of the average temperature for land and water temperature for the entire world from about 1800, which is when scientific instruments could pick that up really accurately, to 2018. And essentially you see huge increases in terms of the warm temperatures, basically from kind of the 80s and 90s and kind of working our way up. 2018 was the fourth warmest year on record since 1880. And that's within like the last 5 or 6 years, which also broke records. So like first, second, third, fourth, fifth, it all happened in the last 6 years. So in terms of heat as a world, we're getting much, much hotter than we've ever been. And that's kind of rolling into 2019. So this is a chart that NOAA puts out on significant climate anomalies and events. And this is from April 2019. And this is all over the world. But you can see the icons that are highlighted with the thermometer is essentially extreme heat events. And it's happening everywhere to great impact to those areas. And we're seeing kind of unprecedented climate trends. Where we almost ran out of municipal water in Cape Town, South Africa. We're shutting down nuclear plants because they don't have enough cooling water to actually cool those towers. Record heat in Japan. I think right now we're having record heat in Europe as we speak. Massive wildfires in Sweden. So the impact of that warming climate has been pretty significant all over the world. And we're seeing the same things happen here in North America. This is the same chart from about 1910 to 2018. You can see, again, much more increasing in terms of temperatures throughout all of North America. This is also another chart put out. This is last June through August 2018 from NOAA in terms of kind of warmest on records, which is those larger circles. And then the smaller circles are second and third warmest in terms of records. And you can see where they're at. We had some here in Michigan and a lot in the Great Lakes Basin. But really, as a whole country, we're seeing excessive heat more than we ever have, and those trends, at least for the moment, minus this spring, appear to be on the same track. This is, again, that same chart for 2018, going back to those significant anomalies. You can see the thermometers on there really all over in the northeast, and then our west coast, and that has significant impacts for all those folks. And then what that triggers in terms of storms are part of these anomalies that are pretty significant. This is a graphic from August of 2018 that shows the essentially above average temperatures by county for every county in the United States given in August 2018. And you can see the reds are the record heat. So if you remember from the East Coast from last summer, we had record heat in the Northeast. And we had a pretty good swath of that here in Michigan and then also in the Midwest. Kind of a trough in the middle of the United States, but kind of both bookends in the Great Lakes Basin in terms of extreme heat. And again, those trends are starting to continue. One thing that NOAA does is they put out these billion-dollar weather climate disasters. That's billion with a B. And part of that is related to, again, our changing climate and how hot everything is getting. Those produce these crazy storms that we're seeing, especially this past spring. We're seeing massive amounts of flooding throughout the Midwest and those other severe storms. But that's about a dozen storms within the United States, or the dozen climate disasters, over $1 billion. And what we've seen is that over time, there used to be 5, then there's 7, now there's 12. We're seeing more and more of those happen on an annual basis. This is the annual temperature, average temperature for a year from 1895 to 2017. And you can see the kind of the trend line going up. We're getting warmer. The other thing that we're seeing is you can see the difference between the dots at the top of the graph and the dots at the bottom of the graph are getting more dynamic. They're getting spread out more. So our highs are getting really high, our lows are getting really low, but overall we're still trending to much more heat within the state of Michigan. This is the average daily temperature from December to February of 1895 to 2018. Again, those trend lines are continuing forward. I don't think we're seeing any kind of significant changes in terms of where that's going. We're going to be getting warmer as a state and as a Midwest basin. So one thing that the Great Lakes Integrated Science Assessment, GLESA, which is out of University of Michigan and Michigan State, is kind of NOAA's regional office for climate data. There's 9 different offices in the United States. The one for the Meadows happens to be here in Michigan. And they put together this really easy, simple slide. So if you're talking about some of these issues with your communities, this is one easy slide that you can show that just shows the trend. So these are observed regional changes within the Great Lakes Basin. Essentially, average temperature has gone up by about 2 degrees from about 1900 to 2012. Total precipitation is going up about 11%. And going back to some of those earlier slides, those heavy storm events, those 500-year storms, 200-year storms, they're happening much more frequently, and we're seeing that increase go up quite a bit as well. Guy's going to talk about Great Lakes ice coverage. That's gone down, but we'll see from Guy's presentation, that's one of those things that goes up and down based on the year as well. But overall, probably less Great Lakes ice coverage. And some of those benefits might be that we actually have an extended frost-free season, which may be in some opportunities for our agriculture. Looking forward, so what GLESA does is they take all those models that we have and they kind of start to predict, okay, what else are we going to see? Are those trends going to continue? And essentially, yes. It's going to be warmer and wetter is really the kind of the bottom line. And we expect to see more of those heavy storm precipitation events, plus the number of hot days going up, which has impacts, especially for those communities at the southern end of the state. So thinking about our last spring and how wet it's been, I keep seeing these memes on Facebook about like the entire state of Michigan completely flooded and all you see is like one peninsula sticking out. We've all experienced the rain and what that means for our Great Lakes water levels. So essentially there's three influences to our Great Lakes water levels. One is rain and snowfall that just falls into the lakes. The other was the amount of evaporation that happens over the Great Lakes. And then essentially it's the runoff from the surrounding land into the Great Lakes through rivers and tributaries that contributes to water levels. And right now we're really at all-time high for many of the lakes, or pretty close to it. These slides were provided by Dr. Andreessen from Michigan State University at a webinar about a week and a half ago, if anyone participated in that. That really talks about what's going on right now. And Guy's going to get into more detail about this, but I just want to show a couple of slides that provides the context for essentially the last several months, what we're going to see in the future for the next couple of months, and obviously what we've been experiencing. Obviously heavier than normal precipitation over the last year. This past May was the second wettest on record. The last 12-month period between June 2018 and May 2019 was the wettest 12-month period ever recorded. So not just from that June to May, but in any kind of 12-month period, it was the wettest on record. So these are charts that NOAA puts together. That's departure from normal precipitation. That obviously the more purple you get, the more that you have in terms of precipitation. We've all seen the images of the Midwest where farmers can't even plant crops at the moment. And we were experiencing that here in the Great Lakes Basin, not to the extent of kind of lower Wisconsin, the Iowas, and even Ohio and further south, but still way above normal. This is from June of 2018 to June 2019. The percent of normal precipitation also you can see increase in our basin. So we've had a lot of precipitation happening over the last year. Some are from Muskegon, I heard in the back. This is just from a weather gauge there. The thin line, this is laser work, it does. Okay, this is the kind of the normal. And right before September, we're actually kind of in a little drought. And then September, this is essentially how much rain we've accumulated. And you can see those by month, how much that spiked. Just a tremendous amount of precipitation, not only happening here in Muskegon, but also throughout Michigan and Great Lakes Basin, just to show how much water we've accumulated over time. And that's really given by the jet stream. So we talk about these kind of climate models in a kind of large abstract way, but as you know, for a lot of what we deal with, the daily pattern is really influenced by the jet stream, and we just happen to have this very persistent upper air pattern that's bringing active storms, that moisture from the Gulf Coast and moving it up to the Great Lakes. How many folks saw this picture of good old Waldo Stadium completely flooded not too long ago. These deluges of rain are happening again more and more throughout our community, and it looks like that's going to continue on for the foreseeable future here this spring. This has those impacts for why the Great Lakes, one of the reasons why the Great Lakes are so heavy. This is a snow water equivalent. This is about essentially how much snow and water are on the ground. This is in March 23rd, and you can see, especially as you go towards northern Michigan and the UP, a tremendous amount of snow still on the ground in March. Again, that all melts. And Guy will talk about the transition between kind of that Great Lakes basin from Lake Superior, how that impacts the rest of the Great Lakes. All that snow and water accumulated in that area of the basin, I guess that comes all the way down to Lake Michigan, Huron, and beyond. Well, Guy will talk a little bit about that. So what has that done in terms of the actual ground that we're living on? Well, our soil moisture rankings are really high right now. So the amount of moisture within the soil is about as high as it can handle, which is the chart you see on the left. And then that also has impacts for all those streams and tributaries that I talked about that flow into the Great Lakes. In terms of the conditions, we have a lot of flashy rivers going on all over the state of Michigan, which is part of that dynamic that leads to our water levels. Annual precipitation by year from 1895 to 2017 again shows kind of an incline. Yes?
I wanted to ask you, what about like the 100-year flood mark? I mean, does that have something to do with it too, or?
Right. Nope, you got it on the microphone?
Oh, the question was the 100-year flood mark. I mean, is that what we're into right now too, or?
And that's really an event, and we're talking about kind of overall trends. But as we go throughout the day, we'll talk about a little about what that means in terms of the context of that 500-year storm and 200-year storm. But yes. So this is a slide showing, again, that precipitation by year from 1895 to 2017. Again, the trend going north. Again, you can see that oscillation between the highs and the lows also getting wider as you go from 1900 to the kind of where we are right now. But again, more precipitation into the system as we're moving forward. Another chart from NOAA that really shows for the entire upper Midwest region, precipitation in May, again, that trend line going north. So for the foreseeable future, these are some of the predictive maps. This is a couple of months out of what NOAA's predicting, that we're kind of on that edge of, again, additional precipitation. Depending on when you look at these charts that NOAA puts them out, they kind of ebb and flow during the day. But when we talk to Jeff Andreessen, the state climatologist, he's expecting more of this kind of wet, coolish climate, at least into parts of July and then maybe later into July. So that provides, I just want to provide a little bit of the context on the climate piece, some of the things that we were talking to communities about as we just introduced this idea, and then how that all flows into the coastal dynamics piece, which Guy is going to talk to.
I'm Guy Meadows. I'm the happy professor and no tests. Dick's the grumpy professor. I spent 35 years as an engineering professor at the University of Michigan in ocean engineering. Then in 2012, was invited to help start the Great Lakes Research Center up at Michigan Tech. So I moved to the UP then. This is a good slide to start with, and one thing Dick and I do have in common, so I'm glad there's no microphone holding us to the podium. We both like to walk around. I live up here now, above the snow line, and I guess, let me back up for a minute. What I really like to do today is to talk about the interconnections. Harry did an excellent example on talking about the sorts of trends that we're seeing, but please ask questions, and I really want to get the points across of how things we see, like ice cover in the Great Lakes, how those eventually manifest themselves in some of these types of events that cause communities to be non-resilient. So again, we'd like to have a discussion rather than a lecture. So the entire Great Lakes system is 90% of the U.S. surface freshwater, a full 20% of the whole world's surface freshwater. 53% of that is in Lake Superior alone. Another way of saying that is the combination of all the water in Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario is less than the amount of water in Lake Superior. And we have just busted our all-time high in terms of water level. We had a tremendous snow cover, as you saw from Harry's talk last year. Up in Houghton, Hancock, again, where I live, we exceeded 330 inches of snow, 28 feet of snowfall this year. And some of that's still in the woods. So we will be seeing Lake Superior draining water to the lower lakes for at least the next couple years. So this is the winter of 2014. It was a really big winter for us. Ice cover in the Great Lakes was about 93% or so. During this winter, some really interesting things happened that are related to things that you're going to see later here in the presentations in terms of massive changes and rapid changes in Great Lakes water level. So just think about 90% of the U.S. surface fresh water going from year after year of very low ice cover to a year of almost 93% ice cover almost instantly. What kind of massive changes that must have been in the atmosphere. And then if we move 3 years ahead to 2017, total amount of ice cover, same time of year, is only 19%. So again, another huge swing in conditions in the atmosphere above the lakes. And keep in mind, there is 10 times more water transported in the atmosphere above the Great Lakes than flow out the St. Lawrence Seaway. So the vast amount of water that is exchanged between the lake comes as precipitation or evaporation from the atmosphere. So these are huge changes that are happening on a continental scale. So ice is a really good indicator. This is the history of ice in the Great Lakes going back to 1975, and we've had other high years of ice cover. But I think without too much squinting, you can see as we go through time that the really high ice years are about the same, but the really low ice years are constantly decreasing. Or the spread, again, the variation between one year to the next is continually increasing. So 2014, we were here at 93%, huge drop to 19.4, and then right back up to a big ice year this last year. Do we have time for stories? Yeah? Yeah. Let me go back. Do you know the history of Isle Royale and the predator-prey studies? So, longest going 60-year study of predator-prey between wolves on the island and moose. So moose stand on the shoreline of Canada and look out and say the grass is greener over there, so let's go for a 25, 30-mile swim. So the moose swim to the island. But the wolves only come across on the pack ice. And 2014 was the first time in 35 years that Lake Superior completely froze across. So everybody was really excited that new wolves from Canada would come and repopulate, because over that 35-year period, the wolves became very inbred with no new wolves coming to the island. The island is very isolated. And in addition, somebody brought little Fifi to the island, and Fifi brought canine parvo virus to the island, which also worked to decimate the wolf herd. So the wolves were down to a brother and sister that no longer could have pups, no successful pups, and there was one or two other wolves left on the island. Well, in 2014, everybody's fingers were crossed, new wolves would come to the island, but one of the females voted herself off the island, said, I had enough of my brothers and sisters, and she was promptly shot on arrival to Canada. So now wolves are being repopulated artificially on the island, but we've had now these couple of years of natural ice and the ice bridge building itself back, and there was a visit last year by at least two wolves from Canada did a circle around the island, and decided to go back home. So it's an interesting study to keep watching, so I encourage you to do that. But kind of here's the history again from 2012 to 2014 in terms of maximum ice cover, 2017, and again 2019. So these huge changes are happening more and more frequently. And Harry did a good job, so I won't bore you with a lot of things, but here, 2017, these are continental scale events. First time you ever saw two hurricanes chasing each other up the East Coast. We see storm after storm, very intense rain events that are really sucking water all the way up from the Gulf of Mexico or from the Pacific Ocean and dumping it in the upper Great Lakes. So as Harry said, it really depends on the storm tracks, where they cross the United States, and whether or not they're within the drainage basin of the Great Lakes, which is a very small area. The drainage basin is only about twice the size of the lakes themselves. But we've been in the bullseye over the last several years with these massive storms, bringing that 10 times more water than flows out the St. Lawrence Seaway. Results in huge snowfalls for those of us who like snow. We have a network of coastal monitoring buoys throughout the Great Lakes. Each of those buoys every 10 minutes reports to several publicly available websites. You can go on and get the data. You can download any year you want for any buoy or any parameter. Each buoy measures a whole bunch of different meteorological and oceanographic type parameters. This is our buoy on the north side of the Keweenaw. This is significant wave height, which is what your eye sees if you look out at waves. So we have a 8-foot wave event, 3 days later, followed by a 16-foot significant wave event. So we're seeing these really intense storms having great impacts on the shoreline. And in terms of these interconnections, let's think for a minute. So you got more storms, more intense. They bring rain or snow. That's what ultimately fills up the lakes to make them, and we'll talk about this in detail in a minute, to make them high water versus low water years. Well, the storms also, as we all know, bring a lot of wind. So we're seeing these big wave events too when it is more stormy. So during years when Great Lakes water levels are high, wave energy is actually 25% greater than it is during years when water levels are low, because the storms that bring the water also bring the wind, which result in waves. That changes the place waves work on the shoreline. When water levels are high, they're right against the bluffs, and the wave energies are much greater, and that causes very, very rapid recession, and that's the situation we're in right now. So these interconnections, I think, are important. This is one of those big wave events, Lake Superior, very popular place in the summer. This did result in a death. This same location in the summer. So these are very big. 16-foot wave events are very, very big. In a 16-foot, and it made me thinking back to the Edmund Fitzgerald, where waves were 25 to 30-foot events. That's the average, what we call the significant wave height. It's what your eye sees. It's what we train the instruments to measure. It's the average of the 1/3 highest waves. So in that distribution, if it's a 16-foot, 1/3 highest average wave, every so often, in fact, once every 5,000 waves, there is a wave twice that size. So if there's if the average is 16, there are some 32-footers out there that if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, that can be very devastating. But those, again, eventually find their way to the shoreline. There's been a number of media reports, which sometimes are useful.
This system has already created a wild weather phenomenon along Lake Michigan.
A seiche hit areas from Ludington to Manistee. Look at this video from Manistee, where the water quickly rose in the Manistee River, causing some damage to the docks and the river walk. Ellen Baca back now to explain what happened. Ellen?
All right. Yeah, guys, this is really interesting. So a seiche is basically a big slosh of water as you have a storm system that pushes wind down and that piles up the water as it approaches shore. So it's almost like when you get sloshing back and forth in a bathtub, and that initial slosh is caused by a big burst of wind. So this was taken just minutes apart. You can see water encompassing, almost overtaking the pier here in Ludington, and then that water pulled back out as the lake tries to find equilibrium. So if we look at this storm system here and watch as it moved through the Ludington area, it looks like any other strong storm you might see. But this had pretty potent winds, and it was enough to hit Ludington with about a 42-mile-per-hour gust. And the linear nature of it here, as it moved on through into Ludington, helped to generate that big push of water. So how much water moved? Well, the water level fluctuated within an hour of about 1.5 feet, which is substantial. This is usually the fluctuation we see within a 24-hour period, and then you can see that big back and forth thanks to the seiche.
So as the name implies, it's very similar to a tsunami or a seismically generated sea wave. Yep. So again, 1.5 foot water level change over about a half-hour period is something to really be concerned about. It has in the past resulted in loss of life. So back to the big picture. This, and I know it's hard to see, but this is the history of Great Lakes water levels from 1914 to the present. Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, Huron, which are at the same level because they're connected at the Straits of Mackinac, Lake St. Clair, Lake Erie, Lake Ontario. So we have really excellent water level elevation data in the Great Lakes going back to the Civil War. But because the Great Lakes are new features geologically, as the glaciers retreated that formed the Great Lakes, the earth is still rebounding. So the data back to 1914 has all been rectified for that earth rebound. On that point of the Great Lakes being new features geologically, they are still very steep-sided and very deep. And the natural trend, which we call background erosion, is for them to get wider and shallower. So independent of human influences on the coastal dynamics and the movement of sediment up and down the beach, there is a background erosion rate. In most places of in Lake Michigan, for example, where it's all a sandy coast and very erodible, is about a foot per year. So again, if you want to buy waterfront property, you want to pass it on to the grandkids, make sure the house is a long ways back. But the point here is, we had in Harry's presentation, a great picture of the Dust Bowl and the impacts of changing the prairie grass root structure. Well, these are the Dust Bowl years. Very low water levels, not only in the western states, but also here in the Great Lakes. Very, very clear definition of that. We have seen high water levels. The all-time high for most lakes is 1986, right here. Then we went through about a 15-year period, Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, of very low water levels. And those very low water levels caused the beach to build back. But the material that you'll see in the pictures coming up that is eroded during high water level is the glacial material that has been compacted by an ice sheet that was almost a mile thick. The stuff that comes back is the little wind-blowing sugar sand that we're so proud of here in pure Michigan, and it has no potential to resist the wave action. It goes away very, very quickly. So that's another point that's important in this. So we go through this period starting in 1999 of very low water levels. Here, the beach starts building back. That's also an affluent time. A great deal of coastal development occurred during that time. And as the beach is growing and is wide, we'll show you the actual surveys of those beaches. It looks safe. It looks great. What's the problem? Well, the problem is water levels will come back as they have in the past and are now coming back with a vengeance because of this variation that we see in the bigger atmospheric patterns. So here in detail, 1986, high water level, Lake Michigan, Lake Lake Huron, up here, plus 4 feet, kind of normal fluctuations happening, then a precipitous drop about 1999, and then this long period and actually all-time low records here in 2013, and then a very quick rise, which is continuing today. So now water level is back. We're seeing flooding everywhere, and we're starting to see some serious beach erosion as well. Here's the numbers if you need them for engineering calculations. Lake Superior's all-time high, 603.38. We're at 603.2, so we're inch away. We actually broke it later this past month. Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, 582.35. We're now about a half a foot away from matching the 1986 all-time high water levels. Lake St. Clair has already busted its record, same for Lake Erie, and same for Lake Ontario. Back to the beginning. More water in Lake Superior than the other lakes combined. It's at all-time high. It's going to go higher, and all that is heading downhill towards you all. We're very sharing people in the UP. We'd love to share that with you. This in cross sections shows that Lake Superior here, connection to Lake Michigan, Lake Huron is through the St. Mary's River. Lake Huron, Lake Michigan are at the same elevation because their connections at the straits. Detroit River, St. Clair River to Lake Erie, Niagara Falls to Lake Ontario, and then out the St. Lawrence Seaway. These are the latest Corps of Engineers forecasts for water levels. So the red line is the long-term average. And this will start here at Lake Superior. So this is 2017, 2018, and then the latest here for June of 2019. The black lines are the all-time lows and the year in which they occurred for each month, and the black lines up here are the all-time highs and the, again, year for that month that they occurred. So Lake Superior, very rapid increase here. I think this is the Corps of Engineers not being willing to face reality. I don't think it's going to flatten out the way they say. I think this slope is going to continue. I'd say we're probably going to be at this high excursion. If we move ahead, the same graph here for Lake Erie. Again, we see the same thing. We see very high, rapid increase over the last few months. And again, I think it's going to be higher than the Corps predictions. And again, for Lake St. Clair, already busted its all-time high record. And again, with this steep of a slope here, I don't see the justification for that to fall off the way the Corps is predicting. And Lake Michigan and Lake Huron is the same story. And again, here in Traverse City, flooding is getting to be a very routine thing. Okay, what is our data based on? Last time we had high water levels, 1986, Matt's group then was wise enough to fund us to create 36, well, 45 in total, but 36 along on Lake Michigan shoreline, permanent survey lines that went from the top of the dune to a water depth of 30 feet offshore to catch how does this beach respond to changing water levels. We surveyed those multiple times per year from 1988. It took us a year to get going after the high water in 1986 through 2008. So for 20 years, we surveyed all those lines multiple times a year. So I know the Lake Michigan shoreline much better than I should. So what does that look like? Here's what a typical survey line. This is, I was at University of Michigan then, so Summit Township in the Ludington area. First survey was in May of 1988. The red lines, last survey was in 2008. Shows the top of the dune, how that changed, the beach area, how the nearshore bars have changed as a result of that. And then a good survey, all the lines should fall on top of themselves once we get out beyond about 25 feet, because that's what's called the depth of closure. The waves that we typically have are not able to move sand once it's out 20-some feet. So if the Corps of Engineers dredges a harbor and takes the sand offshore and dumps it in deep water, which is the most cost-effective thing to do, that sand is lost forever to the beach. So again, what we're trying to do is work with the state so that sand on the beach is viewed as a natural resource and we keep it in the nearshore region. So here's, not only did we do surveys, but we also took pictures. So here's what the beach looks like after the last all-time high water level. So trees falling into the beach. The beach itself is very flat, carved out. Waves have obviously reached right against the bluff, causing sharp erosion. All down the beach, Chickening State Park, same thing, pieces of the road thrown over to try and stabilize the entrance here to the park. Very flat beach, almost no relief. All the sand has been moved offshore into those offshore bars. The beach the natural beach is the most resilient beach form you can have. If the beach is allowed to move the way it wants to move, it will take a shape that is in harmony with the incoming wave energy and water levels. It will take a shape that is the most dissipative to those incoming waves. If you do something to mess up that natural process, like pin the intersection of land and water, like they're attempting to do here, you change the ability of the beach to naturally adjust to the changing conditions. So we all like to buy a piece of property. I've done the same thing. Have property lines and say, this is mine. I can do anything I want with it. True, but if you impede the beach's ability to readjust, you will cause yourself more heartache in the long run. Moving down the beach again, here's Ludington North, very same story, very steep bluff, obviously eroding, things coming out of the bluff. Trees falling down the front of the bluff. Again, Juanita Street in 1989. Here's another view. Take notice of the house. The revetment here put again during the high water in 1986 to save the property. You can see the offset here that you may pin your intersection of land and water, but you adversely affect your neighbor. Here it is in 2008, and 2008 again is about halfway through this long period of low water levels and resulting beach building. This is the same house we just looked at. The beach has inflated in this area about 8 vertical feet of perfectly beautiful sugar sand. You can barely see a little bit of that rock revetment we saw in the previous picture. Our survey marks were buried here about 6 feet down. Here it is today. So we're getting right back to what it was in 1986. But, so the lakes come and go, right? The water level comes and goes, beach builds back, but every time there's one of these events, you will retreat more than the previous one. So when this erosion event that we're going through right now is over with, it will be further back than it was in 86. So the lakes are constantly doing that broadening thing. Again, here's Summit Park we looked at a few minutes ago. Here's the survey site. Here it was in 1989. Here's the path coming down. Here it is in 2008, our last survey, totally inflated. Here's the path coming down here. You could almost not notice that that is the same location. And this is our poster child. This is U of M Survey Line 1. It is right at the Michigan-Indiana border. And it's our poster child for a number of reasons. So the road commission here, there's a road right above, has put in these giant limestone boulders to try and save the road. This is a storm drain from the road, totally suspended in air. As you can see, about 6 or 7 feet above ground level. The beach is totally eaten away. All the sand is transported offshore. Here it is in 2008. You wouldn't know that, again, that's the same place. Here's the end of that pipe. Let me just go back. And again, to look at how that has changed, here it is this year, in 2018, and a new house is being built right above those same rocks. So, survey-wise, 1988, first survey is this red line, and you can see how scoured out the beach is. And then the last survey line, 2008, is this black line. So in this extreme example, this is in feet. We're talking 20 feet of vertical addition of wind-blown sugar sand. And perhaps more importantly, the ordinary high water mark, which is the distinction between what the property owner can do above the ordinary high water mark without permits, is here. And since it's an elevation standard in 2008, that intersection of the state's jurisdiction is here. So below the ordinary high water mark, you need both state of Michigan and Army Corps of Engineer permit to do any construction. Above the ordinary high water mark, it is your property. Dick will get into all the gory details on the legal side of that. You do not need permits. So there's nothing to stop the property owner from building something out here on all this sugar sand above the ordinary high water mark. And most of our memories don't go 20 years back to know that that was not there in 1988 or 1986. So here's how that beach has changed over those years between the surveys, which is pretty impressive amount of beach material. And again, that happened, as a reminder, 2008's about in here during the, this prolonged period. It continued to grow beyond those points. Our funding for doing beach surveys tracks right along with water levels. So when water levels are high, it's easier to get funding, and when water levels are low, what's the problem? This is the same spot. This is the Michigan-Indiana border. This is our survey line right here. This is aerial photo from 1998. 580.5 is the water level there, so it's about a foot and a half below where we are today. In 1986, the water level was right here at the base of the bluff, the blue line. So what is the natural tendency when you got a big wide beach that looks so beautiful and so safe is to build? And Dick will go through the history. There was actually an attempt to build a house on land that was not there in 1986. So the thing I want to leave you with is our beaches are continually changing. They're changing above water, the beach part that we see, but keep in mind that beach runs out to about 30 feet of water depth. Beyond that, they're changing out there too. And they change on very rapid scales. I mean, this is, St. Joseph. We always send this kind of picture to Washington, D.C. with our proposals. Isn't it beautiful? And now I have a new crusade to send these kind of pictures to Washington because they do not seem to understand the magnitude of the changes we experience here in the Great Lakes and how rapidly they happen. between low water level in the Great Lakes and high water level in the Great Lakes is about 6 feet. And you can see that that happens over a couple of years. The East Coast is all nervous about having a foot of change over 100 years. And we see 6 feet of change over 2 years. So we are an excellent model for what is going to happen on the East Coast as water levels continue to rise. Great. Thank you very much, and glad to answer any questions anytime.
As I was watching these two presentations, I was thinking a little bit about the difference between shocks and stresses and how important public perception is for government action. And I kind of wonder over time if what was once a shock can start to seem more like a stress, because a huge rainstorm that drowns everything, the first time it happens, everybody kind of loses their mind because it wasn't expected. But when you get it 5 times in 6 years, it starts to seem more normal, and people kind of, I don't know, it starts to seem less like an emergency to people because it's become more the new normal. And I just wonder, I assume as we get into kind of the ways to address this, we're going to talk about that, but I just kind of wanted to throw that out there as a thought, up front, so that we can kind of address that as the conversation moves on.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. Part of the reason we have this show on the road here now is it's a teachable moment. We have people's attention. They're seeing it happen in real time. Some of the areas in Lake St. Clair, I don't know what to tell people. Some of these developments that were on sand spits are on sand spits, but soon were on sand spits. What do you do? And, there's just places where we should not build. We did an analysis again for Matt and his group for the state on looking at what the worst possible scenario might be given the changes in water level we've seen in the past and what we're seeing in the future. And we used to use the 100-year storm. The probability of this water level occurring is 1 out of 100. But we're seeing that sort of thing in wave height, in storm surges, in all these parameters that affect the dynamics of the coastline. We're seeing them routinely, like you're saying. So we went in that analysis to the 500-year storm, which is only a little bit bigger than the 100-year storm. And what used to be way far out there that, what are the chances of that happening, are now becoming more and more normal. And, you talk about 500 years, it's hard to get people's attention. You don't care about 500 years from now. It's not going to affect you, but that storm could happen tomorrow.
Right, so again, I'm Dick Norton. I teach in the Urban and Regional Planning program at U of M. I'm both a planner and a lawyer, and so I wear 2 sets of hats. And I'll use both of them for this. This is Guy and I have been collaborating now for about 15 years on this topic. And as a researcher, studying local planning and shoreline dynamics is an incredibly fascinating thing to study because, as I like to say, people like to build in exactly the most fragile, beautiful, and dangerous places. And they don't want to be told, no, you don't, that's not a good idea. And so how do you reconcile trying to keep these places functioning naturally and providing all of the things they provide, at the same time respecting the idea of people having private property rights and the right to do something that they want to do with their land? Totally fascinating. Completely frustrating to watch when you see houses getting ready to wash into the lake. So a little bit mixed sensibility there. As much as there are physical system, climatic, and shoreline dynamic systems complexities to worry about, now we have to think about the complexities of the legal system and the planning system. And what I'll try and get across today is the physical realities of the world don't often line up with the legal realities of the world, especially in shoreline dynamics, because so much of our law is based on the notion of fixed land fixed land boundaries and such, and that just doesn't work on a shoreline. So there are a lot of difficulties that we have to deal with in these particular settings. So the first thing I like to ask is, well, what does it mean to be coastal? This is all about coastal resilience. And again, there are kind of physical realities of it, and then there are legal realities of it. So you go out and look for lots of definitions, and you can find definitions that are based more on the physical realities, something about the physical dynamics, the proximity to standing water, to littoral systems, and then the legal realities. Well, it's the jurisdiction that abuts a lake water, and it maybe includes the whole township, even if only a little tiny sliver of the township happens to touch water. For our purposes, simply, Great Lakes coastal communities are communities that touch our inland seas. One of 4 of our 5 Great Lakes. I like to mention, one of my colleagues has a great bumper sticker on his car. Michigan truly is the Great Lakes state. The bumper sticker says 4 of the 5 Great Lakes prefer Michigan. I think that's so cool. We're the Great Lakes state. And as I mentioned earlier, 251 townships, cities, and villages in the state of Michigan touch one of those Great Lakes, including Lake St. Clair, which is, sorry for you Lake St. Clair folks, it's not a Great Lake. It's an almost Great Lake, I guess. I don't know. I keep asking, why is it not a Great Lake? And it's just not big enough for whoever defines what a Great Lake is. But it's part of the system. So lots and lots of communities touch Great Lakes waters in the state of Michigan. So how many of you are not from Michigan originally? Several of you. Are you from other states that are township states, or did you come from elsewhere? Do you know? Municipalities, yeah. There are different governmental systems across the US. A lot of folks who grew up in Michigan don't realize that in some ways we're kind of unique. Michigan was one of the Northwest Territory states as part of the Northwest Ordinance that set out trying to settle the continent early after we formed as a new nation. All of these areas were surveyed into survey townships and then formed into a governmental system. So we actually have 2 kinds of surveys in Michigan. Survey townships were those early survey areas that were designed to try and get folks to settle the state as quickly as possible. And then a civil township, which is actually a governmental unit. In the non-township states, there are no townships. If you're in an incorporated municipality, like a city, you live in a city, and then you're also part of a county. But if you're outside of an incorporated municipality, you're just in the county. All of your governmental services are provided at the county level. But in Michigan, we have this 3rd level of government in between, the civil township. And so by far, the other thing I like to say is for a state that claims it doesn't like a whole lot of government, we have so much government in the state of Michigan, but it's all at the local level. We have 1,859 units of local government in the state, and a lot of them touch Great Lakes waters. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, except that it means that a lot of our governments are pretty small. Of those 251 units that touch Great Lakes waters, 90% of them have 10,000 or fewer residents. So in terms of a service provision capacity issue, that's pretty small. A lot of those communities don't have the ability to have on-staff, full-time planning staff and other kinds of services, which is why in a state like Michigan, planning consultants play such a huge role, because you provide the ongoing, those of you in the room who are consultants, provide that kind of capacity that communities need to function. It's also the case, so if you live in a non-township state, counties do a lot of zoning, or the cities do zoning, but in Michigan, counties don't do much zoning. The legal authorities are such that the townships, cities, and villages have the authority. The only time counties zone is if they're basically asked to do so by a township, and they're basically zoning on behalf of the township. So for the most part, I'm not going to talk too much about counties. I'm talking mainly township, cities, and villages here for the things we'll discuss. So I want to just give a really quick background. I've been studying Great Lakes shoreline dynamics since I got to Michigan in 2001, and early on we started looking at the Great Lakes. So I did my doctoral work and my legal training in North Carolina, and I studied ocean coastal shoreline management for my dissertation, and then I came to Michigan and found out that Michigan has a ton of shoreline. In fact, did you know Michigan has, depending on how you count it, the 2nd longest coastline in the continental US, second only to Alaska. Alaska. If you add up all of the Great Lakes, the US Great Lakes shoreline on the Great Lakes side, and add all of that up, it's longer than the Pacific and most of the Atlantic shoreline combined, and longer than of those seaboards. And it's because if you think about it, it's like a string that's crunched up. If you stretch that string out, it gets really long, really fast. So we have a ton of shoreline. And I'm going to talk about this in a minute more. And most of the authority to regulate land use in the state of Michigan has been delegated down to local units of government. And theoretically, at least historically, it hasn't always been the case, theoretically the idea is you should plan first and then zone to implement your plan. Historically, we've tended to zone first and then do the planning to explain why we did what we did. That's not really a good way to do it. So we're trying to get communities to better use their planning authorities to do the analysis, to document what's going on, justify the zoning and the other policy mechanisms they're going to adopt, and do that in a rational, appropriate way. And so I'm looking at planning as a policy argument. One where the community master plan analyzes the conditions on the ground, documents what the community goals are, identifies and analyzes policies, and then communicates those policies to local officials so they have a sense of where should we be heading, to residents so they have a good idea of what they can and can't do on their properties, and then the lawyer in me will tell you to communicate to judges so that when they're, if you end up in litigation because a property owner is not happy with what you did, what's your best defense against a due process claim? You're behaving rationally and reasonably given the conditions you have to deal with. How do you show that? You've got it in your plan. You've got a good analysis that documents, here's why we're doing what we're doing and why it's reasonable, right? So planning, from that sense, even in a legal perspective, comes really important. So the plan in this country is the policy document. It's not legally enforceable, and then we implement the plan theoretically through the regulations we adopt, zoning, subdivision, the legally important policies we adopt, public infrastructure, and through public outreach and education. This is all, should just be refresher planning 101 for you guys. But it has implications for analysis. So what we did about 10 years ago was start collecting coastal community plans and start to evaluate the content of those plans to say, well, how good of a job are coastal communities doing at analyzing the issues they would need to analyze to do good coastal management? And you can look at a plan in two different perspectives. One is the quality of the plan. How good is it at documenting and presenting these analyses? And then what's the policy focus? How many policies have these communities adopted? And what we've looked at are to promote urban development, to promote conserved rural areas, to deal with water quality, and then specifically how much are they adopting policies to deal with good coastal management. So this just came out in a paper that was published in 2018 in Land Use Policy. We studied 139 randomly selected communities. About 2/3 of them we could find planning documents online. So there may be some smaller ones that have plans, but we couldn't get a hold of them. And then we systematically analyzed 60 plans and collected some survey data and demographic data to do some analysis. And what we found was that almost half of the plans we had evaluated had no analysis at all in them of their coastal areas. Uh-oh, that's a problem. Even worse, almost 2/3 of them had no policies at all dealing with coastal management. So let's stop and think about that. Here I like to say, we looked at a ton of coastal community plans in Michigan, and for a lot of them, you wouldn't know it was a coastal community except it had a picture of a lighthouse on the cover. They're not paying attention to their coastal shorelines was the message we got out of that. And that was part of what prompted maybe we should be, the state of Michigan got interested in this, Matt in his section, maybe we should be working to try and get coastal communities to start paying more attention. And I'll tell you why in a few minutes. So what do we think is going on? One is the infrequency of the problem. The lakes were low for a really long time. Who's worried about this? It's not a problem. There's some weirdness going on with the way we insure disasters in this country with FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program. And then some political pushback. We don't want to be regulated. Plus, a lack of detailed knowledge. How many of you had a good working knowledge of the way shoreline dynamics work before you listened to Guy's presentation? One or two. Why would we expect local residents and officials to understand this stuff if it takes having to hear it from Guy Meadows, who's been studying it for 20 years, to explain what's going on here. So there's a whole lot of room here to be educating folks on how these dynamics work, which is, by the way, what we're hoping you folks will do as you head back out and work with your communities. You're getting the training now, and all of these slides will be available to you to use for that. So we're hoping you can carry this forward and start playing that important role. The other problem we think is going on is a lack of technical capacity and frequent turnover of public officials. So not only is it a case that you have to educate folks, you have to keep educating them over and over again because local officials turn over as folks retire, move on, and do different things. So it's always a different set of conditions. So we're looking at capacity to plan, knowledge about issues and how to plan, and then commitment to do so. And we postulated that those things all are important for explaining plan quality. If you have those things, you're going to get higher quality plans. And we speculated that especially having substantive knowledge about coastal issues and commitment to do something about it would lead you to have policies that would promote good coastal management. So that's what we looked for when we evaluated these plans. Here's what we found. Having in-house planning staff and a lot of land use activity seems to be improving plan quality. It was associated with that. I think the frequent land use activity is tripping commitment because communities that have to deal with land use regulatory issues pretty frequently get it. They understand the need to do good planning to justify the decisions they're doing. They're more committed to it. They understand the issues and the processes better. Here's what we found in terms of plan policy, though. Housing values meant that community being up meant that they were more likely to have coastal management policies. People maybe in those communities are worried about having good management. Having in-house planning staff meant they were more likely to have good policy. Having had a consultant prepare their plan meant it was less likely they were going to have coastal policies in their plan. Now, I was a planning consultant for a number of years before I went back and finished my graduate work. I'm not shooting at planning consultants here. I think what's going on is planning consultants serve lots of communities. Only a small portion of them are coastal communities. They have a general approach to helping communities with their planning. They don't think about the special issues of coastal planning when they come into a community. They use kind of the same template plan, which is fine. And they step through the issues and they just do their planning. And it's only when a community member points out, hey, wait a minute, we're a coastal community, we need to deal with this issue, that it gets up onto the table. So I think that's what's happening, which is, again, another reason why we're really wanting planning consultants to be part of this presentation so that you can add good coastal management analysis and policymaking into the services you can provide to the communities you work with so that we don't see that continue. That having consultants do your work for you means you're less likely to deal with the coastal issues that you're dealing with. Does all that make sense? Okay, so that's the background for what we're doing here. So now let me step back and put my law hat on, my lawyer hat. Let's talk about some key legal doctrines that are in place on Great Lakes shorelands that are unique, that kind of shape what you can do in the community. There are basically three sets of legal doctrines I'm going to talk about. One is the police power prerogative, I call it. The prerogative is the authority that a government has to act. We often talk about local rights, but I think that's actually the wrong term to use. Governments don't have the right to act, they have the authority to act. So let's call it police power prerogative. The public trust doctrine, which is unique to Great Lakes settings, and then private property rights. And what I do, I don't have this good image of shorelands here, I have people. And all of these are basically common law doctrines. And so what I do is put up images of people who are influential in shaping those doctrines, and what that means is they're all old dead white guys. Because that's all judges who were in power some time ago. The police power prerogative is the power to protect public health, safety, morals, and the general welfare. Have you heard that phrase? You ought to have, Sarah. I'm looking at Sarah. She took my planning law class some years ago. I used to tell my students, go to bed at night and recite the police power is the power to protect public health, safety, morals, and the general welfare. Where does that come from? A little bit of history. Let me ask this. Of the three levels of government, federal, state, local, which came first? Ha! You didn't know there was going to be classroom quizzes. Which came first? The states. Why did the states? What were the states before they were the states? The colonies, right? The original 13 states were originally chartered colonies on this continent, chartered by the English crown. Now, there were people here before that. Are there any Native Americans in here? I want to point out, there were people here before that who resided and were doing quite well living with nature by all accounts. I don't want to wax too nostalgic about Native American communities, but there were people here. So I'm basically talking about legal doctrines that came over with the colonization of this continent by the English crown. The states are the original sources of authority in this country. And early on, the states realized if we're going to function, when we separated ourselves from the crown, they realized if we're going to function as a national government, we need to have a national government. So here's another quiz number 2. They tried to set up a national government that didn't quite work. Do you remember what that was? Articles of Confederation. It didn't work because the colonies, the new states, were so fearful of a monarchical national government that they intentionally designed it to be quite weak. And then pretty quickly, the new states started competing against each other and kind of undermining each other in a way that wasn't working. So they sent folks back to Philadelphia in the middle of August to revisit the Articles of Confederation, and they realized pretty quickly, we can't just kind of tweak what's there, we need to start whole cloth. So I always like to think about this. Think about August in Philadelphia in 1776 and closing the shutters so nobody could see in. How stinky must that have been? They crafted what became now the US Constitution. And so the thing to know is the Constitution constitutes the federal government, and what it represents was the states having ceded some of their inherent authority up to the national government. You with me? The states are the original plenary sources of government. They have all the power. The federal government, theoretically at least, only has the power to do what the federal government has been enabled to do through the US Constitution. Early case law in the country's history started to play out, well, what is that? What exactly does the federal government have the authority to do, and what do the states have? And one of the early concepts that came out was, well, what do the states have? The states have this notion of a police power. Police power was a term that at the time meant public policy, basically. That's where this articulation of the notion of the police power came from. The courts, John McLean was a US Supreme Court Justice. Lemuel Shaw was the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. Early case law was struggling with what authorities exactly do the states have to do? And what they came up with was this notion of the police power. The police power is the power to protect public health, safety, morals, and the general welfare viewed broadly. So it's a very broad authority that state government has that gives it the ability to do all kinds of things, to regulate for environmental protection, to regulate for commercial development, all of those kinds of things. All of the authorities that we're working from, for the most part, are coming out of the police power prerogative. Does that make sense? The second doctrine that's at play on Great Lakes settings is the public trust doctrine. So this is the doctrine, the notion that there are some things common to all: the air, the running water, the sea, and the shores of the sea. Where did that come from? Well, the oldest fellow up there was Emperor Justinian, Roman Emperor Justinian, who in the 6th century ordered that all of the laws of Rome be codified in the Justinian Digest. And one of the early rules that were articulated was this notion that there are some things common to all: the air, the water, the sea, and the shores of the sea. And what that meant was these resources have some attributes to them that allow at least public access to the use of them over time for different reasons. And that was taking place primarily on the ocean coastal setting of the Roman Empire. That was in about the 6th century. In about the 12th century, Henry de Doctrine, a legal theorist, wrote a treatise, Here Are the Common Laws of England. And of those, in that treatise he wrote, there are some things common to all, and he picked up almost verbatim the language that had been written in the Justinian Code: the air, the water, the sea, the shores of the sea. Matthew Hale was another English jurist writing in the 1700s, And he repeated the same language. In England, the common law of England is some things are common to all, the air, the running water, the sea, and the shores of the sea. Well, right about that time, then, we separated ourselves from the English crown. We're a new body. We have 13 states, plenary authorities. We're taking in law, and we're a common law country. So we have judge-made law that's accreted over time that tells us what we can and can't do. So what did the English state or the American states, where did they look to say, here's the law of our state? They looked to English common law because that's the heritage of the body of law that we drew from. So Joseph Engel and James Kent were early American legal treatise writers who made legal hornbooks saying, here's the common law in the US, and they included in that, in the common law of the US, some things are common to all, the air, the running water, the seas, and the shores of the sea. Ironically, what that means is, theoretically at least, this notion of the public trust doctrine is quite a bit older than police power authority, because it stretches clearly all the way back to Roman Justinian law. What's happened over time is all of the coastal states have picked up the public trust doctrine and said, this applies to us as well. So all of the ocean coastal states have a public trust doctrine that applies to the ocean coastal shorelines. And early on, the Great Lakes states looked at their Great Lakes waters and said, you know what, our Great Lakes are more like oceans than they are like inland lakes. They seem to function dynamically more like ocean coastal settings. So all 8 of the Great Lakes states have adopted the public trust doctrine. Because it's coming out of this common law tradition, the public trust doctrine is a state-specific doctrine. It's always articulated by state courts in combination with state legislatures. So Michigan has a public trust doctrine that is much like the other 8 Great Lakes states, but it's a little bit different.
Does it not include groundwater?
No. So that's a good question. The question was, does it not include groundwater? So the original notion of the public trust doctrine was it's in coastal settings. And all of the Great Lakes states adopted it for its Great Lakes water. So in Michigan, if you are on an inland lake, that's not subject to the public trust under this original concept. It's only Great Lakes waters that have the public trust. Now, there have been legal theorists who have been arguing we should take this notion of the public trust as it was originally developed and expand it to all natural resources. And some states have gone there. There are a handful of states that have slowly over time started to incorporate notions of public trust into their environmental laws. Michigan really hasn't done that.
I'm just curious about why Nestle can bottle and sell essentially groundwater with that.
It's not in the public trust. And that's a good place where the physical realities of the world don't line up with the legal realities. Under the law, groundwater is conceptualized as not being connected to surface water. It's the way it is in the law. So effectively, Nestle's taking Great Lakes water, but because they're doing it through the groundwater, it's not subject to the public trust. Okay, you with me so far? So we have this public trust doctrine. This creates some complications that I'll talk about in a minute. But let me finish off the third legal doctrine I'm grouping together as private property rights. So have you been in a meeting and had someone essentially say, by God, I own this land, it's my property, and I have the right to do whatever I want, and the hell with the rest of you, pardon my language. I'm not exaggerating too much, am I? That's the strong part of an American ethos, is that we believe in private property rights. I like to say, I often go to communities and folks will tell me, we're different from other places. We believe in private property rights here. I have yet to go to a community and have them tell me, we don't really believe in private property rights here. That would be un-American. We believe in private property rights. And when people do that, by the way, when they make that claim, by God, I think they're harking back to really a John Lockean notion. Do you know John Locke? John Locke was an English philosopher. He actually had been, for a while, was the manager of the Virginia colony. When it was a chartered colony out of England, he was the manager of that colony, became a legal theorist, and he was writing political theory that was shooting at the English crown in favor of the barons. He was trying to make the case that the English crown, the king, didn't own it all, that the barons had interests in land that meant something. And so he made up this theory, literally, of the idea of mixing land with labor. It's a natural law theory and a Christian theory. He was a strong Christian theologian, and he basically said, well, humans are created in the image of God. That makes us sacred, a sacred autonomy that can't be impinged upon by others. When humans go out to the undeveloped landscape and they mix their labor with the land, they imbue into that land a sacred autonomous identity that creates the private property right that then creates this right that is separate from the state. Does that make sense? So I think this kind of moral sensibility that owning property is a God-given right, that it gives me the right to do what I want, and even the government can't stop me, is very much a John Lockean notion of private property rights. Now, there are a couple of problems with that. One is John Locke said, of course, this only holds if there's enough land for everybody to divvy up and have. Well, that doesn't also work. And he also said, and it only works if we leave the land as good as what we found it, basically, for others. So the Lockean provisos. So we've also been pretty good in this country about picking up the pieces of historical theory we like and then forgetting the other parts that kind of go along. He articulated that notion of property rights. Blackstone was an English theorist who basically picked that up and said, in England law, we believe in private property rights, carried out over time. That really diffused then through the US, this notion of private property rights as being a sacred notion. And in a way, in this country, a notion of ownership that came before the state. So really conservative legal theorists will argue the property rights came first, the state came second, and the state exists to protect private property rights. Liberal theorists, the Rousseauians of the world, now the English and the French, will argue, no, the only reason we have private property rights is because the state recognizes them. The state creates private property rights and it protects them, and what the state giveth, the state can taketh away. In a Lockean world, the state didn't give me my rights, they existed first, so the state can't take them away from me. They exist separate from that. Does that make sense? That's the legal debate that is alive and well, let me tell you. And it plays itself out on the court, even today, and it's going to continue to play itself out because of the way our US Supreme Court is shifting with its membership. I put up Oliver Wendell Holmes here. Have you heard of the notion of regulatory takings? You probably should have. It's the idea that sometimes under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, if the government takes your property from you involuntarily, it can do that as long as it's for public use and it pays just compensation. Nobody ever thought that that provision in the Constitution applies to regulations until Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote a decision in 1922, the Pennsylvania Coal decision, that said, when a regulation goes too far, we will deem it to be a taking. The theory is sometimes government doesn't take title to your property, it just regulates it away. So the example I like to use is government decides, we would really like to have a park here, but we don't want to buy it. So we're going to adopt a zoning code that basically doesn't let you do anything but raise butterflies on it. Not much of a market for butterflies. You've effectively, through regulation, taken all of the ownership interest from that property owner. A court could look at that and say, no, you took that property, you should compensate. You basically took title. Does that make sense? So the regulatory takings doctrine wasn't part of the original legal theorizing in the US setting, but since 1922 and the Pennsylvania Coal decision and subsequent decisions, it's now well established. I don't see it going away anytime soon. And it really came to the fore when we started to regulate landscapes for environmental protection. That's where we really get the rub. People don't like to be told, you can't build here because we're protecting this landscape for the environment. Well, you're taking it from me, you should pay me for it. So here's where the extremes are. If you basically argue, anytime you tell me I can't do whatever I want with my land, you have to pay me for it, that's kind of extortion. That's not living as part of the community. At the same time, if government says, if we think we're preventing a harm, then we have the right to tell you you can't do whatever you want with your property, too bad for you. Well, that's, if you zone for butterfly parks, you're basically going too far. So there's a balance in between that the law has tried to struggle to strike over time. Does all that make sense? That's the legal framework. So the key idea for private property rights is you, in this country, even Justice Scalia acknowledged this. Justice Scalia, one of the most conservative justices on the court, since passed away. Owning property means you get to do what you want with your land to a point. You have the right to reasonably use it. You have the right to reasonably exclude. It doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want and the hell with the rest of you. Government has a reasonable justification for sometimes telling you, no, you can't do that. So all of this is to say these three doctrines are at play on a Great Lakes shoreline, and especially the public trust doctrine is at play on Great Lakes shorelines in a way that you don't find then in the rest in inland lakes or on riverine systems. With me?
How is the public trust doctrine adopted? Is it in a statute, the language?
Yeah, so the very first mention of the doctrine was, we became a state in 1837. There was a Chancery Court decision handed down in 43, 6 years later, where the court just kind of said offhand, well, of course, the state owns the submerged lands of the lakes because it didn't use the word public trust, but it was citing to that. And then there has been a really long string of Michigan Supreme Court decisions since then that have reaffirmed we have in the state of Michigan the public trust doctrines. And that means, I'll talk more about this in a second, but it means the state of Michigan owns submerged lands in the lakes and it has an interest on the shoreland. And then we adopted in 1955 the Great Lakes Submerged Land Act, which kind of, in a way, used statute to codify that public trust doctrine. So it's kind of a mix of common law and statutory law. Okay, so actually that's a great lead-in. So here are the now statutory authorities that feed off of that. So we have laws in place that create local governments. There's a law that allows us to plan. There's a law that allows us to zone. The Natural Resources Environmental Protection Act does provide some provisions for coastal shorelines to manage for high-risk erosion areas. And then there's some other authorities at play. Under the public trust doctrine, it's really a state doctrine, and it primarily enables state law. So the actions, the regulatory actions that you can really directly trace to the public trust doctrine happen at the state level, not so much at the local level. And then we protect private property in multiple ways. We have lots of protections built into the MZA that are designed to prevent government from abusing us in the statutory provisions. The key protections, though, are federal and state constitutional doctrines, the way we've organized government, and then the protections we built in especially for due process and regulatory takings. So those are the mechanisms that we use to work with. What I want to point out here is, and what I'll mention here is the state's authority to regulate shoreland is actually pretty limited. The state of Michigan owns submerged lands, and it has an interest in regulating shoreland up to the ordinary high water mark, and it also has authority to regulate where there are designated high-risk erosion areas. Those are different parts of the Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act. Only 10% of Michigan shoreline is designated high-risk erosion area. So there's a whole lot of shoreline out there that's not getting any special protection by the state. And most of the state level protection is happening pretty far lakeward. So there's a huge gap. So you saw, coming back to Guy's point, the Great Lakes are slowly eroding about a foot a year. That means in 60 years, you're going to have property that's going to be underwater that's nowhere close to where the state is regulating. It's really in the hands of local governments to be thinking that far ahead and adopting policies that help protect against imprudent development in the near shoreline areas. So yeah, so that's a good segue. That's where I'm headed. So how do you define the ordinary high water mark? That was a great segue. So here's the problem. The concept of the public trust was established in ocean tidal settings where the water levels go up and down twice a day. And the key legal demarcation for the public trust doctrine in those settings is generally taken to be the high tide line. So the legal effect of the public trust doctrine in those places is you especially have a right to walk on the beach during low tide. It's what gives you the right to beachcomb when you're out on a North Carolina coast. And maybe even a fair bit of the dry sand beach, depending on where the mean high tide line is, right? Does that make sense? The problem, so this is one thing I learned from working with Guy and Laurel for so many years, is the ocean coastal shorelines are in a much more homeostatic setting because that happens twice a day. So the profiles of the ocean beaches don't change as dramatically as they do on a Great Lakes beach because it's in a more, is that right, a homeostasis kind of condition. So you can have pretty dramatic changes in tide levels. You know, some places they go up by 10, 20 feet, but the shoreline is kind of in an equilibrium. In a Great Lakes beach, we do have periods of high water and low water, but it's been stretched out over decades. And so there are portions of beach that have been underwater and definitely will be underwater again, but maybe not for another decade. And there are stretches of the beach that will be open and dry and sandy for long periods of time. And the problem is, because of the way the lakes go up and down, we're in this kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back problem. When the lakes are high and they're eroding quickly, the shoreline's moving pretty fast inland, but then they drop and then they gain time. And it seems like they do that in a period that we easily forget when they're down that they're going to come back up. And we had that especially long 15-year period just before now that I think gave a lot of folks a lot of comfort that this isn't an issue that we have to deal with anymore. So how do you mark this legally significant boundary on a Great Lakes shoreland in a way that's parallel to a high tide line and an ocean coastal doctrine? And we effectively have now 2 ordinary high water marks. So the most recent Michigan Supreme Court decision that recodified or kind of reaffirmed that we have a public trust doctrine was the Glass v. Geckel decision. Anybody familiar with this? It's the beach walking case. So this was a lot of law that we deal with are basically neighbors who are spitting at each other sometimes and are not happy. And in this case, Joan Glass lived on property that was not on the lake, and she had always walked across her neighbor's lawn to get to the beachfront. She had an easement, I think. The beachfront owners changed ownership. Apparently, she wasn't a very nice person. I don't know. I've never met her. But they started kind of spitting at each other. They weren't happy with each other. And the shorefront property owner informed her they weren't going to let her walk on the beach anymore because it was their beach. And that made its way all the way up to the Michigan Supreme Court. And the court came down with a couple of key things. One was, we have the public trust doctrine in the Great Lakes. It's alive and well in the state of Michigan. It exists. The second thing the court did was say, and under that public trust doctrine, the citizens of the state of Michigan or the people visiting the state of Michigan have a right to walk on the beach below the ordinary high water mark. That was the second thing the court said. And then the third thing the court said was, and we're going to articulate a particular ordinary high water mark for the sake of beach walking. And it's the watermark now that we refer to as the natural ordinary high water mark. In the Glass decision, the court said the ordinary high water mark for the purposes of beach walking is the point on the bank or shore to which the presence of water has been so continuous as to leave evidence of there having been water here. So here's the question I ask. Where do you think on that slide is the ordinary high water mark? The easy point to mark out is the beach grass. So at the very least, it's there. But stop and think for a minute. In this part of the world, if you don't have water eroding away on a shoreline and you leave it go, what will you see in about 10, 20 years? What? Grass will come up in a year or two. It's very quick. What will come up in about 15 years? Trees. The tree line. The fact that there's a lot of grassy area there and that there's a clear tree line says to me, I'm looking at my college and engineering colleague, there's been water there in the past. When the lakes were the last time high, they were up all the way to that tree line probably. So you could make a case that's the natural ordinary high water mark. That's the place on the beach where there's evidence of water having been in the past. The thing is, it was there probably 20 years ago at the last ordinary high water mark. I don't think, so remember, this is the mark for the sake of beach walking. Fortunately, most people, I don't think, like to want to go up and tromp in beach grass. So this ordinary high water mark definitely means, so we've done this presentation. Are any of you shoreline front property owners here? We've given, you are? I'm sorry? Your parents, yeah. We've given this presentation now really all around the state. And up northwest especially, we've had shoreline property owners sitting in the front row glowering at us, quite happy because they didn't want to hear what we had to say, and point out to them, there's a public trust interest on your beach. You can't tell people you have to get off my beach. It's your beach, but there's a public trust interest. It's kind of like an easement that allows people to walk along the beach. So right after glass came down, we went out on the beach and saw lots of people putting snow fences out into the water and putting up do not, private property. And we would tell folks, no, you can be out there. You just have to carry a copy of the glass decision with you and point out to them where it says that. Now what we're seeing are more signs more like this. People are recognizing we can't tell people you can't walk on the beach, but please respect our private property, right? What we know from the glass decision is you have a right to walk on the beach. I don't think you have the right to have a barbecue in front of somebody's private home. So I try and urge folks, think about the Great Lakes shorefront as like a sidewalk in front of a house. You have a right to walk along the sidewalk and look at the homes and the street and such. You don't have a right to have a picnic on your property on the tree lawn of your neighbor. So that's the balance that we need to strike. So when I look at online dialogues with this comes up like, where can you walk? And I see it from both sides. Property owners saying, it's my property, you can't be on my beach, get off. And then I see other people, it's the public trust beach, I can do whatever I want, don't go, go away. Well, again, there's a middle ground there that we need to be urging communities and folks to be thinking about. Does that make sense to folks? So that's the natural ordinary high water mark for beach walking purposes. The other thing, yeah.
Before you leave that, with high water now approaching 86 levels, it'd be really interesting on these beaches to see if it does go to the tree line. I have every reason to believe it will.
Could end up back there. Yeah. Okay, so that's the first ordinary high water mark. The second thing the glass court said was there's still this other ordinary high water mark that applies for the purpose of regulating of the state's regulatory programs. So that's why I say we actually have two ordinary high water marks. Now, the second ordinary high water mark is an elevation-based standard. So Guy mentioned in passing, the way we measure lake water levels is off of what's called the International Great Lakes Datum, IGLD. And it's a benchmark level above sea level. So 580.5 IGLD means that's a water level that's 580.5 feet above sea level. Sea level, up until recently, has been pretty stable. It's not been moving too much. But lake levels go up and down pretty dramatically. Sea level, where it's stable, where the shoreline is in equilibrium and it's not eroding tremendously, you can draw a high tide line and it's going to be pretty stable over time. Does that make sense? But if you're on a Great Lakes beach where the levels go up and down over decades and it has the effect that it has on shifting the profiles of the beach, an elevation-based ordinary high water mark becomes really problematic. So Guy and I authored a paper that's in the Journal of Great Lakes Research that points this out. There's a lot of trouble with using an elevation-based standard, and this really highlights it. So remember that beach that he showed right at the southern edge of Lake Michigan, the Michigan-Indiana border? That became the basis of what's the Burleson decision. This was a Michigan Court of Appeals, and right after glass came down, the Burlesons, who owned this property, sued the state of Michigan, basically arguing we don't have to get a permit from you because we're above the elevation-based standard. And the state of Michigan argued at the time, no, we look at both the natural glass watermark and the regulatory watermark. And the Burlesons had a site plan to build a house. And I read the briefs. I filed a brief on behalf of MAP to argue, don't do this, don't do this. And in the briefs, the attorneys were arguing, the ordinary high watermark is way out there. There's not been water here for thousands of years. And the state of Michigan took an image of the site plan and they laid on top of it a rectified photo of where the beach had been only 20 years prior to say, that's not true. That part of beach was underwater 20 years ago. The way the law works in lawyers' minds is not the way the ground works in coastal engineers' minds. And that's a huge source of disconnect. So what Laurel Meadows did for us was show over time, that's where the ordinary high water mark was in 96. Wait, that's where it was. Where do we start? 98, right after high water, all of that was underwater. Then the lakes were low for quite a while. The ordinary high water mark, this elevation-based standard, is starting to move lakeward because the beach is inflating. And then we had a period where the waters came back up again, then they moved way out there. When these folks were proposing to build their house, the beach was all the way out there, And this elevation, the idea is you draw an elevation, and where it hits the beach is where the ordinary high water mark is. If you're lakeward of that, you have to get a permit. If you're landward of it, no permit. The Burlesons were arguing, we're way above, we're way landward of where that place is hitting the beach, we don't have to get a permit. And the Court of Appeals said, you're right. Kind of. The Court of Appeals said the elevation-based standard is the standard that applies for the state's regulatory programs. But then the court said, I'll take this as a personal point of pride, but one of the parties filed a brief that says you have to be careful on how you actually cite that mark on the beach. We're not addressing that question here. So they left the door open to basically for the state to say, no, no, even though the beach may be out here now during a period of low water, the ordinary high water mark is actually back here. And at the time, the state was taking a very property owner's conservative perspective and saying it's out there. Now they're adjusting their rules a little bit to try and move it back in to recognize this dynamic. But they're constrained by the way the state's administrative rules are written right now. So this is another reason why local communities should be paying attention to this, because not only does the state regulation not really address shoreline management very much, the way the state has to apply it is really deferential. If anybody hits the right day when the lakes are low, they can get a permit. They can build without getting a permit because the state says you're below ordinary high water. We don't have to permit you. Does that make sense? So does that answer your question about where the ordinary high water mark is? It turns out to be a really hard question to answer. And it changes from day to day depending on how you define it. So here's the poster child. And here's where you get into trouble if you don't have local control. Anybody know where this is? See, this is in St. Joe. Anybody guess where the folks who built that house lived before they built that house? Yeah, well, usually, you guys are smart. Usually, when we're on Lake Michigan, the first thing I always hear is, they're from Chicago. There seems to be a lot of antipathy towards Chicagoans on Lake Michigan. Or then I'll hear they came from some place and that didn't understand the lakes. They actually lived right there. And they're lifelong St. Joe residents. One of the things Guy touched on briefly that I'll talk a little bit more in a minute is on this side of the house, the Army Corps of Engineers built a harbor structure to protect the outlet of the river there. And when you put an outlet like that into the lake, given the predominant movement of sand, you start trapping sand. And so there's been a substantial amount of accretion on the north side of that harbor structure. And we've presented this now a whole bunch of times, and I often have folks come up to me and say, I know those people, and they're really nice, and they're horrified by what's happening, and I'm probably horrified that we're using them as the poster child. But they apparently thought they were protected enough because of that harbor structure they could get away with this. But here, let me show you some imagery. So that's what that stretch of beach looked like in 38. What it looked like in 60. 85, that house behind it has now been built. 96. 2002, now we've had low water for quite a while. There's a lot of sand that's been accreting. By 2011, they've built their house. That house has been underwater multiple times in the discernible past. When the property owners decided they wanted to build a house, because look, the lakes have gone down, we've got all this beach, we want to be closer to the water, they went to the city of St. Joe and asked them, do we have to get a permit? And the city manager, at the time he was the planning director, told them, well, we don't have any way to stop you because we don't have any zoning code provisions that would stop it. And the state of Michigan, because of the way it was applying its high-risk erosion area and submerged land permitting requirements, said, nope, you're landward of the ordinary high water mark, you don't have to get a permit. So the city manager is telling these property owners, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, you're going to regret this, don't do it. They did it. They went ahead, all they had to do was get building permits. They didn't have to get any kind of special land use zoning permits. That immediately PO'd the neighboring property owners because they understood enough what's going to happen. The lakes are going to come back up. They're going to want to get a permit to armor in front of them. That's going to start scarring away our beach. We don't want that to happen. They gave the city of St. Joe multiple, I think $40,000, $50,000. So this is a fairly wealthy group of property owners. gave the city tens of thousands of dollars to hire an engineering firm to do a study so the city could justify adopting a zoning code setback to prevent additional structures from going in. That's what it's looked like in the past. The city did that. The city adopted, did a study, adopted a setback. About 5 years later, the lake waters are lapping on the front porch of that house. The property owners came into the city to see about getting a permit to build arming structures, and the city said no. We adopted a setback. Where they adopted the setback basically runs right there. And they based that on their engineering studies, and so now this became a non-conforming use. When they came back in, the city said, nope, we're not going to give you a permit to armor. You can't put any additional structures in. So all they had the ability to do was to pick up the house and move it. So the other story I like to tell is we gave this presentation in South Haven this last fall, and I was talking to went out to dinner and was talking to the restaurant manager and telling him the story, and he said, oh, there was a house in St. Joe, and my buddy has a company that moves houses, and he heard about this property owner who was going up before the city council to get a permit, and he said, they're not going to be able to move it. So he went to the meeting and with his business card, and when they denied the permit, he handed him his business card. And so now the company that moves the house has on their website, look what we can do for you. Right? So it probably cost them multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars to pick that house and move it back. I'm sorry?
Where?
They moved it right there. So they're still not quite out of harm's way, but they couldn't get it any back further because of the adjacent structure. So that house is at risk.
They have two houses, right?
They have two houses, yep. And the other thing we're seeing people doing, I was out there last summer, and noticed a lot of these shoreline property owners are blowing out these dunes. They don't like not being able to see the water, so they're bringing in bulldozers and blowing all that out to get a better view. Well, if you're a shoreline property owner, a highly dynamic beast, the last thing you want to do is take away the natural vegetation. So the other thing I'm really curious to see is, as the lakes are up and stay up for a while, how much of that beach is going to get lost, and what are we likely to see where they've done that. So now we have, I want to come back to a point that Guy made earlier and kind of stress this point. The point is this: if you were to go to a stretch of natural Great Lakes beach where there's been nothing put in place, and put a post down, and then come back every 10 or 20 years, what you would see would be pretty much the same thing. The beach would look largely the same, except that because of the background erosion rate, it's going to have slowly moved landward, right? The long-term process is for the shoreline to continually move landward, to continually recede. People don't get that when they see the beach. Even if they've lived there for 20 years, they think it's the same beach. They don't recognize easily that it's moving slowly landward over time. The source, when you start, so Harry kind of did some Photoshop magic just to show, it looks like the same beach, but it's moved landward. And if you're in a place where there are high bluffs, it's not going to move by inches slowly over time. It's going to move by multiples of feet when the bluff fails. You'll get these catastrophic bluff failures. So we have pictures of homes tinkering on the edge, just waiting for the next storm to take out that bluff, right? The problem is folks don't want to see their house go into the lake, and so they want to be able to armor. And frankly, our state's shoreline management laws are pretty flexible in allowing people to armor. You can see remnants of the last round of armoring that were put in place probably in the 80s, last high water, and that's been overtopped. So two things to take from this imagery. One is, when you put up armoring, you are starving the beach of the sand source that it needs to continue being a functioning beach. All of the sand. Guy was talking about the sand that is in the system that eventually gets lost when it gets deep enough. All of that sand that's in the system, some of it's sand that gets pushed up from the beach, from the shore, but a lot of it's the sand from the failing bluffs behind it. And so when you put up a seawall, you're starving that sand supply. The other thing you're doing is putting yourself in a position of having to continually maintain armoring. It's not the case that you put an armoring and you're done. You're now looking at ongoing costs to maintain that structure because the beach is just going to keep pounding away at it over and over again. So that's what the natural beach looks like over time. It's just moving. We've armored a whole lot of our shoreline. Most of our imagery is on Lake Michigan because that's where we've been doing most of our work so far. Anybody guess what that thing is? It's a pool. It's a whale-shaped pool. And a whole lot of armoring, and armoring that failed before, and now a whole lot of more armoring that's gone in. Just other imagery of armoring. Here are a couple images that I took from a presentation that the Army Corps' chief engineer did. He commented on his great concern is we're heading towards the New Jerseyization of the Great Lakes shoreline, which I guess if you've been in New Jersey, it's all hardened riprap. There's no beach left because people have protected structures. We could be heading that way as we continually armor to protect beach homes. And his big concern is, even during periods of low water, your thinking might be, well, some sand is going to get pushed back up onto the beach, so we only lose the beach during periods of high water. But there's an image of what that beach looked like at the front end of that long period of low water. That's what it looked like after that long period. Even after 15 years of low water, there's no sand on that beach. It's been so starved of the sand supply that even during low water, there's no beach coming back. We've lost the beach. Does that make sense? So this is the discussion question for this part of the session. In a lot of places along Great Lake shorelands, we are confronting the situation where we may have to decide, we really, in this system, meaning local government, because that's where right now the state is really loath to go there for different reasons. Local government is going to be more and more in the difficult position of having to decide, are we going to protect the beach or are we going to protect the beach house? If we protect the beach, that means we're going to prohibit putting in armoring structures to allow the beach to naturally move and change over time, and that means you may lose a beach house into the lake at some point. If we decide we're going to protect the beach house, the only way to do that really is to armor. There's a lot of talk about using living shoreline systems. Those work pretty well in inland lakes. They don't really work well on Great Lakes shorefronts because there's just too much energy in the system. So you might delay erosion a bit by putting living shoreline features, and certainly you don't want to remove vegetation, natural vegetation, because you're accelerating the erosion problem. But over time, the beach is going to erode. So the only way to protect the beach house is to armor. And what that means is you're going to lose the beach. I've had people ask me, does that mean, so let's stop. I'll just put a couple comments on the table and then we'll have a discussion. So legally, what the Michigan Supreme Court said is we have a public trust doctrine in this state. Under the public trust doctrine, the state holds Great Lakes shorelines in trust for the use of the public. Part of the rights we have as public owners of that public trust beach is the right to walk on the beach. And the state has an obligation to protect that right. Does that mean the state has a duty to tell shoreline owners who have armored and lost, to the extent that we've lost the beach, they have a duty now to tell those shoreline property owners to take it out and let the beach come back? Or have we now created expectations and allowed recognized private property rights to the point where we'll say, nope, you have a right to protect your property, we gave you a permit to armor, that's the end result. Does that mean if you've armored and you've lost the beach, do people now have a right to come up and walk through the backyard and walk where the beach would have been but for the armoring? Neither of those questions have been litigated. I can't tell you under Michigan law how a court would treat those questions, so those are up in the air. So we have a policy question. What are your thoughts on how to strike this balance as planners and policymakers? And then that kind of leads into where might this go legally. So this is the end of my talking for the first session, and we just wanted to open the floor for some discussion and your thoughts. You can use this as questions or make comments or give me your thoughts on all of this. So now we need to do the
I'll just say in the St. Joe example, maybe you know, but in my experience with local government, if there wasn't a lot of neighbor concern and money being thrown at this problem, and so that got the attention of the local, the local officials, I would guess that the local officials would have given whatever permission or blessing to that armoring if there wasn't so much of the neighbors upset and throwing money at it. And so they, the St. Joe's, they chose in that particular case to save the beach. But if there wasn't so much public outcry, in my experience, I would guess that the armoring would have occurred.
Yeah. Let me just say a couple things. You should know, St. Joe actually did a triage. They've got 3 stretches of beach. Where this house is on the northern stretch, and they adopted a setback to prevent people from building structures. The middle part is their city beach, and they benefit greatly because that harbor structure that the Corps maintains, they dredge it periodically. And so they dump their spoils on that beach. So they're getting basically free beach nourishment to maintain that part of the beach. South of that has been entirely armored, and the city looked at that and decided, we're not going to tell those folks. It's really heavily built out and all armored, and the beach is gone. And the city basically said, the beach is already gone. We're not going to push a setback there. So even in that community, they only had the political will to adopt a setback for part of it. I do know, I think Laketon Township has, do you guys have a setback? There are some townships and communities that have gone down the road of saying, we're going to adopt setbacks and we're going to enforce them. And what I'm really curious about is why? What is it about you folks that have allowed you to create the political will to do that a lot of other communities, I think you're right, the great bulk of the communities would be really hard pressed to go there.
Yeah, and just one other comment. I'll be up there for the 4th. My brother has a place near Arcadia, and there's a big public beach at Arcadia that right now, we've been going there for 25 years or so. And right now it looks like a lot of your slides with the steep slope. But right next door is a camp that's been there for decades. And just this last summer, they armored right at the public, there's a big public beach. And I was telling my brother about this and that this is a problem. And he's owned property up there for years and years. And even he, the property rights mentality is, well, if they don't do that, the camp's going to lose they're going to lose a cabin, and what are they supposed to do? They even people who live there, the mentality is, well, they have to do it. Of course they have to do it. And I'm trying to tell them, no, they probably don't have to do it. But that's just a comment. Yeah.
Other thoughts? Questions? You guys are all inured planners. When we've given this talk and we've got shoreline property owners and local officials in the room, we've actually gotten some pretty good dialogue going. Including one fellow I remember in St. Joe who basically said, by God, it's my property. You can't tell me. I have every right to do everything possible to protect it, and you can't stop me. And then the planning commissioner across the way said, wait a minute, that's not quite right. Let's talk this through. Guy. Make a comment, yeah.
Yeah, if I could add a couple things to that. The church camp at Arcadia, I talked to them before they entered in the agreement to do that major construction. And I could not, even though they are a religious camp, I could not get it through them that thou shalt not steal thy neighbor's sand. I mean, that was just a lost argument on that. It'd be real interesting to see how that does in this episode of high water. But the neighbors on either side were very concerned about that. And then that brings up back to St. Joe. On the south side, where the city wasn't willing to do anything, there is a group of about 100 property owners that have 20 years ago filed suit against the Army Corps of Engineers on a Fifth Amendment takings claim. That has worked its way over the last 20 years. It's a long thing, but they've gotten further than anybody ever has before on the Great Lakes. The judge ruled that the Corps of Engineers, in building the structure, which Corps of Engineers only does what Congress dictates they do, but in building the structure and not maintaining the natural flow of sediment, that they were responsible for 30% of the total amount of erosion that has happened in that stretch down almost to Stevensville. And then the second trial was on damages, and the judge there ruled that the Corps of Engineers was responsible for all 1/3 of essentially past, present, and future damages. And that is enormous. And now, well, you know, more the legal thing, but so far it looks like the government may be in a position to have to pay for that.
So, yeah, so building off of that, so the Corps of Engineers has fought that suit jealously for a very long time, because they know if we admit liability here, we're in big trouble, because they have built armored structures all over the lakes and they maintain marinas. And so they don't want that precedent to get set. That particular lawsuit was filed in the Federal Court of Claims, and it's actually gone up and down between that court and the Sixth Circuit multiple times. It's a really confusing, complicated legal case, and what it really highlights is how much the legal system struggles with understanding and explaining the natural dynamics of these systems. Our legal system just is not well geared to deal with the realities of the physical dynamics. Our legal doctrines haven't caught up with our understanding of how these systems work. And so I think what the last we heard was they've actually gone into settlement negotiations. So the court basically, I think, got to the point where we need to just settle this case instead of having it being dictated to us by a court. And I don't know that we know yet what's come out of that. I think they're still negotiating. I'll give you some more law. There is this idea of when might the government be liable if it's building structures has not been fully litigated. There's a case that's fairly close. It's the Peterson decision, came out in the 70s, I think. The state DNR built a boat ramp up north, somewhere in the Networks Northwest region, and then it built a little armoring structure to protect the beach ramp because they didn't want to see that erode away, which had the immediate effect of eroding away the downstream neighboring property. So the property owners sued the state for a taking. Now, it wasn't a regulatory taking, right? It wasn't a regulation. They argued a physical taking. They didn't take title legally to the property, but they took the property because they created a condition that caused the shoreline to erode away more quickly than what it had. And what the court ruled was, yep, that was a taking of property. It was a physical taking of the shoreline property. And I think they did about the same. They ruled about 30% of that beach was eroded away in a way that wouldn't have been by natural erosion. So they were held liable for a portion of the loss of the beach. Now, the court didn't say the state owes them for everything because the beach is eroding. It recognized there was a background rate of erosion that the state wasn't liable for. It was liable for basically accelerating that erosion. I'm not sure the court would have stated it quite that way, but you can read the court decision to read that way. Does that make sense? There has been no litigation that I have been able to find. What happens if a neighbor puts a groin out or a seawall that has the effect of eroding away their neighboring property? Now, in the common law, there's this thing called nuisance. Nuisance is the idea that you have a right to use your property, but not to the point where you hinder your neighbor's ability to quietly enjoy the use of their property. So if you take actions that affect your neighboring property rights, you might be held legally liable. There was a recent Court of Appeals decision that came down, it was, I think, in the South Haven region, where a community association had changed the drainage pattern over its property that seemed to be causing the shoreline beach of the neighboring property owner's beach to erode more quickly than it would have otherwise, and they filed for nuisance, basically saying, you changed the topography, you're causing our beach to erode, you should be liable for nuisance. Does that make sense? And what the court basically ruled, this is a little bit tricky, the court said, if you change a shoreline in a way that creates an introduction of something that wasn't there before, in this case water, and that causes damage, you could have a good nuisance claim. But in this case, the neighboring property owners did such a lousy job of demonstrating that that's what was going on here, they dismissed the suit. So they basically upheld the idea, but in that case they found that the evidence wasn't strong enough to get there. What the court didn't say, what happens if you're not introducing something that wasn't there before, but you're taking away something that would have been there? So if my beach is being renourished from your beach, and you've stopped that movement of sand, and that's causing the erosion, you're not introducing something that wasn't there before, you've taken away, is that a nuisance claim too? The court didn't get there. So I think, I'm not your lawyer, I'm a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer. And I'm not giving you case-specific legal advice, but under Michigan law, there might be a credible case that a property owner could bring if a neighbor armors and causes the erosion, but it's not a slam dunk case because it hasn't been litigated on point that I can tell in the state of Michigan. But so there's some potential neighbor-to-neighbor liability, and there may be some governmental liability if government installs structures that have the effect of eroding a shoreline property.
Do you know if Canada has done a better job? I mean, they have Great Lakes shoreline. Have they done a better job in coming up with laws and either on their,
Yeah. That's a really good question. So Canada is an English common law country like we are, but they don't have the constitutional protections that we do. They don't recognize the takings doctrine, the regulatory takings doctrine. And they're much more deferential to government. So have you ever flown out of Detroit and looked down and thought about the landscape around Detroit compared to the landscape around Windsor? What's different about it? Everything. The Canadian side is much more reminiscent of the European side, where they regulate land development much more. And they get away with it because they don't have as stringent, the expectations are different. There's an expectation if you're in rural land, government can regulate to keep you rural. And if you're in urban land, the government regulates to promote urban development. And in our side of the world, that's not the truth. So you would think that Canada would be doing a better job of managing its shorelines, and I think in some places there are. But I know around like north of Windsor in the Port Huron area, they're having a lot of trouble with a lot of stuff that got built too close to the shore and armoring, so they're also having problems there. And so it's not a slam dunk, yes, Canada's doing a better job. They've got the legal system that should let them do a better job, but private property means something in Canada too, even to that point.
I'm sorry, I got another comment. This is for Professor Meadows, I think. So we just talked about around Detroit, and I think of around Detroit like Lake St. Clair. So not a Great Lake, but Lake St. Clair. And it seems like an awful lot of the frontage, the shoreline in Lake St. Clair is armored, particularly in the urban areas. Is that, natural beach just done? Is that will never come back? And is that kind of what we're looking at in other lakes, maybe?
Yeah, it really is done. There's no natural beach to speak of anywhere along Lake St. Clair shoreline. So,
but now let me give you the legal. So this is good. Legally, even though Lake St. Clair is not technically, littoral scientists don't call it a Great Lakes. It's still considered to be part of the Great Lakes system under the public trust doctrine. So there are public trust interests there. So this issue of what's about, what rights do we have on a part of the beach that's gone are up in the air right now a bit. The other problem with Lake St. Clair, which Guy can speak to, is it's a much shallower shoreline profile, and we've done some mapping. We're going to show you some mapping in the second session about high-risk areas. And properties around Lake St. Clair are in huge trouble, huge risk of flooding. Even under moderate expected conditions. And then you get into the policy question of how long are we going to continue to allow these properties to flood, and how long will the public continue to subsidize replacing them before we finally say we're not doing that anymore. And maybe at some point you start talking about retreat, which might open the door then to restoring them to natural conditions. But there are a whole lot of ifs there, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a lot of litigation there probably to play out as well.
And thinking back to a couple of my slides where we talked about the beach being the most absorbing, when you put a vertical structure in there, that's the exact opposite. The waves hit that, reflect back up, the turbulence level in front of that increases, and this structure will ultimately fail because the water is getting deeper and deeper and deeper in front of that because of the way it's interacting with the waves. So this will ultimately fail not by being beat back by the waves, but actually falling forward because all the support for the structure is being eaten away in front of it. Well, take that then to Lake St. Clair where the whole thing is bulkheaded. So the lake is continuing to work on that. Sand is being moved away from in front of those structures. It's getting deeper and deeper and deeper in front of that. And then when you add high water levels and greater waves on top of that, those things are going to fail both by overtopping and then falling forward in the long run.
To build on that same thought, in the case of Lake St. Clair, there's been discussion of trying to renaturalize some areas by taking those seawalls down. What type of effect does, what extent do you have to do to have an effect? And if you just do a small section, are you creating more of a problem? Or is that going to actually have a benefit?
So if you've got armoring on either side, and a couple slides back you had a good example of that, it's really hard to maintain a natural beach in there without doing something. So there are costs associated, as Dick said, with armoring. It keeps getting more and more expensive and grows until it finally, the cost of armoring outvalues the cost of the property, and then people walk away. If you're going to do a natural beach between armoring, recognizing that there is these reflected wave problems, the way you beat that is by adding sand, called beach nourishment. And think of it like the heat shields on the shuttle. They're sacrificial. So there are continuing recurring costs, again, to maintain that beach. But you at least have a beach. The waterfront is still usable, where in front of that it isn't, but there are costs associated with that in the long run. Really good point.
My question was related to the St. Joe setback. What type of professional services firm did they hire to do the study on which their setback line was determined?
So they hired an engineering firm. I have in mind. I'm mobile. They hired an engineering firm to do a pretty extensive bit of studying to be able to document what's going on in this stretch of beach and where can we justify putting a sea line. I'm happy to report that in the afternoon session, we're going to show you some planning methods and building off of some technical work that Guy has done that I would argue will allow planning consulting firms to basically do the same kind of analysis without having to do the in-depth engineering studies that they did. The kinds of lines that we end up drawing end up lining up pretty closely to what we've gone back and kind of used our methods and set them against what St. Joe did and find that where we're drawing high hazard lines are really close to where they did through their engineering study. So part of the argument I'll make this afternoon is it's within the realm of possibility for you, planning consulting world, to do sufficiently rigorous analysis to document where you think the high hazards area and start adopting regulations that don't require paying engineering firms multiple tens of thousands of dollars in field studies. Sorry if there are engineering firms in here that don't like that, hearing that.
About 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes. Let me just say, if I can, a few more things about this balance between private property rights. And so this is where I spent so much time talking about the history of the doctrines at play on the Great Lakes shoreline. And honestly, part of the reason that I did that was after the Glass decision came down, some legal theorists started writing legal papers saying, oh, the public trust doctrine doesn't have near the historical pedigree that people are claiming. Justinian, it was a faulty analysis, blah, 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 blah. It's really not a good doctrine. And that got me thinking, well, wait a minute. What are the other doctrines at play that we should be thinking about, and how do they line up against the public trust doctrine? And come to find out, the police power authority that we recognize as a sovereign authority of local and state governments in this country isn't as old as Justinian law. Surely they recognize the sovereignty of the crown for a really long time, but this notion that a democratically elected government has that authority is roughly the same age. And the notion of private property rights, the way that we understand it in this country, really only came about when we formed this country. It's arguably doesn't have the historical pedigree as either the public trust doctrine or the police power. Now, the Romans believed in private property rights too, but the kind of Lockean instantiation of it is a very modern American common law doctrine. So the argument I would make that you should be thinking about is, if people come in and start arguing, government has no right to do this, there's no such thing as the public trust, I have private property rights, you should feel comfortable telling them they're all equally coherent and compelling in American doctrines. The public trust doctrine, the way we use it, the police power authoritative, is as much American law as private property rights. The key is not that any one of them is absolute and controlling, it's that we're always trying to navigate that middle ground. Right? There's a balancing that goes on. So you have by the way, I own property in Ann Arbor. It drives me nuts. I get it when the city does something I don't like. What do you mean I can't have an accessory dwelling unit in my backyard? Which right now I can't, technically. What's going on with this city council? I totally get that you have to do that balancing, but at least I can kind of step back and say, okay, I get what the city council is doing. I'm going to work on them to change that law, but there's a balancing that goes on. So where we get ourselves into trouble is when we let people screen off to the extreme, that either because government says so, it's got to be right, or because it's my property, by God, I can do whatever I want. You all know this as planners. The trick is figuring out how to negotiate dialogues to get people to think about that. I've had property owners come up to me after our presentations and say, yeah, we knew when we bought this was probably going to happen, and you're basically confirming our worst fears. So we're not going to armor. We're just going to enjoy the house while we can, and I hope it goes in the lake after I'm dead. But we kind of reluctant acceptance that maybe it's not a smart thing to build too close to the lake. I think there are definitely some communities out there that are finding the political will to say, we're going to protect our beach, because in the long run, it makes sense to do that. And it means if you have to pick up your house and move it, then pick up your house and move it. We're not going to let you destroy the beach, which, by the way, is a big part of our economy, our beachfront coastal community economic recreation economy. We're not going to let that go away so that you can protect your beach house that's right on the water. So that's becoming part of the dialogue that's going on too. And then the other big piece, which we've touched upon, but is going to become more and more pressing as we look for more and more creative ways to protect properties and think about nourishment as a way to do that, is who's going to pay for that? Who's going to pay? That's expensive to go out into the lake and dredge up sand and come in and dump it on the shoreline. Who's paying for that, and who is it protecting really? There are really serious equity concerns here about why is the public subsidizing the wealthiest of the wealthy so they can continue to have a beach in front of their house. And on the Great Lakes, in a lot of coastal settings, ocean coastal settings, quite often it's the least of us that are in the most hazardous places. The old Ninth Ward in New Orleans that was most devastated were the African American communities. Why were they there? Because that was the last thing that was developed, because everybody knew that was a really bad place to develop. It was the only place that was left to them. Having built there, now they're hugely invested in that place and they don't want it to go away, but it really doesn't make sense from a kind of rational planning perspective to keep building there, because we're just going to have to keep rebuilding and rebuilding and rebuilding. On the Great Lakes, most of the properties are not owned by low-income folks. They're owned by the wealthiest of the wealthy. I had one consultant tell me, yeah, they build, and their plan is when the lakes get too high, they're going to bring a helicopter in and pick it up and carry it away that way. That, I guess, to him is a readily movable structure. Hard to see that happening. Or they're just going to walk away. They're basically, we do have the National Flood Insurance Program, which requires that you get flood insurance for a mortgage. I'm guessing, I haven't been able to look into this yet, a lot of those homeowners aren't carrying more insurance because they're not carrying mortgages because they bought their property with cash. They didn't need to get a mortgage. And so they're basically self-insuring. They're shooting, the dice on when will the lakes come up and take my property, which in a way, I'll suggest to you is fine. If we take the stand, you can do that, and if the time comes where you have to move, you have to bear the cost of moving your property. But if we say, okay, you can do that, but then when the damage comes and FEMA comes roaming in and says, let's restore you back to normal, we'll pay the insurance to get you back to build your house, then wait a minute, we're subsidizing people who have made bad decisions and helping them go along. There are some equity considerations there. So I think we need to figure out how to engage in dialogues with communities to really get all of that out on the table and make some good, hard decisions. The reality is we may have to save the beach or the beach house, but at least let's be really clear what are the trade-offs that we're making when we do that. And maybe there will be communities that say we're going to save the beach, and maybe others will say, no, we're going to protect the beach house. So I think this is a good place to finish off. So this is all the kind of background. What we're going to talk about in the afternoon, Guy's going to present some more detailed information on estimates of rescission rates. I'm going to talk to you about planning methods that we've developed that are hopefully the cost-effective way to do good planning without having to do $100,000 engineering studies. And then Harry's going to talk about other coastal shoreline management techniques that planners can use to help make their communities more resilient.